To make America great again, Ardrey Kell negates with two observations. First, the Hill observes that 93% of income gains since the recession have gone to the top 1%, meaning economic growth alone does not alleviate income inequality. Second, the IMF reveals that two of the largest drivers of income inequality are educational attainment disparities and disparities in the labor market. Contention 1 is quality of life. Subpoint A is combating segregation. Housing vouchers are a viable method for reducing income segregation. The Department of Housing and Urban Development reports that Section 8 issues housing vouchers to the disadvantaged to provide them with improved living. Tom Kaplan of the Institute for Poverty reveals that Section 8 vouchers give individuals more control over where they live, allowing recipients to move closer to employment, ultimately resulting in a 9% increase in time spent at work. Thanks to increased wages and lower housing costs, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities reports Section 8 vouchers pull over 1 million people out of poverty annually. In the long term, Patrick Sharkey writes for the Economic Mobility Project that being raised in a high poverty neighborhood increases the likelihood of downward mobility by 52%. Subpoint B is health inequality. Travis Lim of Johns Hopkins reveals disparities in health cause disparities in wealth by limiting workplace opportunities, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. Medicaid is the best way for the government to improve healthcare quality and break this cycle. Luis Ranofsky of the Wall Street Journal quantifies Medicaid currently serves 65 million people. Unfortunately, Merrill Matthews of Forbes reports that Medicaid systematically underpays doctors, paying only 56% of the rate of private insurance. Consequently, Aaron Carroll of CNN reports that many doctors do not see Medicaid patients because they risk closing their doors by accepting too many patients who cannot reimburse them. Therefore, Avik Roy of the National Review writes that surgical patients on Medicaid are 13% more likely to die than patients with no insurance at all, and Grace Turner of the Wayland Institute writes that patients on Medicaid were 97% more likely to die than patients with private insurance. Fortunately, Carroll continues increasing funding for Medicaid will allow the program to reimburse doctors sufficiently, reducing the disparity in coverage quality. Contention 2 is EITC. According to the IRS, Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, is a welfare program that issues tax refunds to low-income workers depending on income and number of children. The EITC rewards those who earn more up to a certain income in order to encourage employment and decrease welfare dependency. This policy has substantial benefits in two ways. The first is in the short term. Jeffrey Brocker of the CBPP finds that EITC has historically been the biggest factor in boosting single mothers' employment, which is why Hillary Hoynes of UC Berkeley reveals that a 10% increase in EITC increases employment rates among single mothers by 6.9%. It is for this reason that Sherry Buckner of the University of Pennsylvania finds that those who received EITC were 53% more likely to be over the poverty line than equivalent households who did not receive the credit. Second, long term. Nicholas Turner of the MBER concluded a $1,000 EITC to a low-income family increased the chance that their child enrolls into college by 10%. Due to educational attainment, Greg Duncan of the University of California at Berkeley finds for low-income children an additional $3,000 in annual family income is associated with a 17% increase in future annual earnings. This is critical because Chico Harlan of the Washington Post reports that the U.S. unemployment rate is currently very low, yet employers simply aren't paying enough. The EITC is therefore necessary to supplement the wages offered by employers. Contention 3 is Pell Grants. The Department of Education explains federal Pell Grants are funds given to low-income undergraduate students to offset higher education costs. Matt Krupnick of the Hetchinger Report explains that Pell Grants often mean the difference between attendance and dropping out for low-income students. It is for this reason that Eric Bettinger of the MBER finds that a $1,000 increase in a Pell Grant corresponds to a 9.2 percentage point decrease in the likelihood of dropping out. Cody Davidson therefore writes in the Journal of Student Financial Aid, without Pell Grants, low-income students dropped out 41% more than middle-income students. Yet he finds with a Pell Grant, they dropped out 5% less often than their middle-income counterparts. Michael Greenstone of the Hamilton Project provides impact, writing that a college degree decreases the chance of continued poverty by 29%. Unfortunately, David Wright of the CBPP reports that the House Budget Committee decided to freeze maximum Pell Grant levels for the next decade, despite colleges' rising costs. Increasing spending is therefore necessary to ensure the continued benefits of the Pell Grant program. Help those who cannot help themselves, and negate.
Hey, everyone good? Amar and I affirm, and contention 1 is America works. Revitalizing America's infrastructure can create and enable access to good jobs for Americans everywhere. Currently, the American Society for Civil Engineers gives America's infrastructure a D+ rating, yet the U.S. government is still projected to underinvest in infrastructure by nearly half the total cost needed. This crisis presents a crucial opportunity to address the failure of markets to produce meaningful employment. Dee Baker of the Center for Economic and Policy Research explains that while there is a sufficient amount of skilled and unskilled workers to fill jobs, the market is not providing enough gainful employment opportunities for all comers into the workforce. Addressing the poor state of our infrastructure in a period of high unemployment would be a perfect marriage of demand and supply. Prioritizing increasing increased spending in public infrastructure alleviates income inequality in two ways. First, Gillian White writes for The Atlantic that investment in public infrastructure and public transit disproportionately prevents the poor from access to economic opportunity and re-entrenches it due to its inefficiency and infrequent access. Michaela Bouchard of the New York Times adds, for many low-income people, commuting time has emerged as the single strongest factor in the odds of escaping poverty. Michael Strain of the Washington Post writes that increased spending on public infrastructure would make our roads great again, decreasing commute times by expanding access, such as, for example, improving the amount of buses within inner cities. Raj Chetty of Harvard University finds that a 1 standard deviation increase in shorter commuting times leads to a 10% increase in incomes for median and lower class earners. Second, prioritizing increased spending on public infrastructure creates jobs. Daniel Alpert of Third Way calculates that both through the direct jobs created by construction and the induced jobs created by increased spending, a $1.2 trillion increase in public infrastructure spending will create 5.5 million new jobs for the economy annually. Infrastructure jobs are critical in the fight against income inequality because creating more employment causes employers to raise their wages to attract workers from going elsewhere. In fact, Dean Baker of the Center for Economic and Policy Research finds that each 1% increase in employment for the lower class increases wages for all low-income workers by 1%, half the effect is seen for middle-class workers, and the rich see no gain in income. Ultimately, Daniel Alpert of Third Way writes, in order to reduce the levels of income inequality in the U.S., there is one thing we need to do above all else: enable job creation via an intense revitalization of our public infrastructure via public sector spending. Contention 2 is homeless to hopeful. Josh Leopold of the Urban Institute found that nationwide only 28 adequate and affordable units are available for every 100 renter households with incomes at or below 30% of the area median income. Not a single county in the entire United States has enough affordable housing for all its renters. Increased spending on affordable housing infrastructure would solve that gap and alleviate income inequality in 3 ways. First, building affordable housing attracts and creates jobs. Keith Wardrop of the Center for Housing and Policy finds that development of affordable housing increases spending and employment in the surrounding economy. Without a sufficient supply of affordable housing, employers and entire regional economies can be at a competitive disadvantage because of the subsequent difficulty attracting and retaining workers. The National Association of Home Builders estimates that building 100 new low-income housing tax credit units for families leads to the creation of 80 jobs from the direct and indirect effects of construction and 42 jobs supported by the induced effects of spending. Second, erecting new affordable housing programs includes the abatement of lead paint, as seen under Senator Kirsten Gillibrand's plan for new housing. This is critical because Anna Iser from Brown University finds that removing lead paint in the home could reduce the black-white test score gap by 37 to 76%. Iser furthers that eliminating black-white disparities in test scores could dramatically induce not only educational inequality, but economic inequality as well. Third is alleviating homelessness. Scott Carrier of Mother Jones writes that policies to construct affordable housing in Utah have reduced homelessness by 72%. Reducing homelessness is critical to alleviating income inequality. Matthew Rodney of MIT finds that the main driver of income inequality in the past 40 years has been access to housing for the rich. This is because housing provides a stable long-term investment around which families and communities can thrive. The Nevada Rural Housing Authority explains that the opportunity of housing for poor and middle-income earners enables access to the most significant way wealth is created for low and middle-income communities. Because we help not everyone, Amar and I are proud to affirm.
Ready for cross?
Yeah.
Everybody ready? Mm-hmm. Yep. So just for clarification, what kind of infrastructure are you advocating for in your first intention?
Like which part of our first intention?
Like all of it.
So public transit is specifically improving the number of buses and the number of subways that improve access to poor communities.
Okay, buses and
These
subways.
number of jobs, the jobs that we create within the second part of our first intention would be rebuilding and repairing infrastructure like across the
Like roads and bridges and highways and stuff.
Sure.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
So let's talk
So
about.
can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah, sure.
First question. Okay, cool. So let's talk about health disparities, right?
Okay.
So why has Obamacare not solved the deficiencies within Medicaid?
Because in the status quo, 26 states block access to Obamacare, like for their citizens, which causes 2.2 million people
Wait, but those
need
are
it to not have access.
26 states block the specific, the way, block the Obamacare insurance program to actually grant access to like the actual insurance.
Yeah.
But Medicaid itself is a different program. Obamacare increased the amount of spending for Medicaid.
Okay.
Right? So why is that not solving the deficiency?
Because like it still needs more spending. Because in the status quo, it's still only reimbursing doctors 56%
So
of what they would get with
so
private.
what's the date from that?
I mean, you can call for the card afterwards. I don't have all of them memorized. Now, can I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
So, in your second contention, what was that LIHTC you brought up?
low-income housing tax credit unit.
Is that what the whole contention is like about? Like that?
Not necessarily.
So like, what is this affordable housing? Because that's the government's affordable housing plan, right?
I mean, like, so, like, the government incentivizes builders to build affordable housing using the low-income housing tax credit.
Okay, so like,
There's
a
other
really-
ways that the government.
Let's talk about
So
the
two things, right? There's other ways that the government can incentivize them to build housing. That's like a federal program, right?
Got it.
Individual states also have their own policies to make
Got
builders
it.
construction.
So let's talk about the LIHTC.
Sure.
So what do you have to advocate for as the affirmative resolution?
Okay, if you're gonna say that this is a welfare program, you are patently false.
It's not a welfare program, but
It
it's
is public
certain-
infrastructure.
It is certainly not, because you
Why?
actually have to apply and be below a certain income threshold in order to receive the LIHTC.
No,
Meaning that
it
if
isn't.
I make
No, you're wrong.
$250,000 and
Here's
you
why you're
make
wrong.
$50,000, I can't get
Here's
the
why you're wrong.
LIHTC. That
Because
doesn't
it
sound
does
very
not go to
public to me.
individuals. It does not go to individuals. It goes to businesses.
You still have to apply and be below an income threshold to receive the
How
credit.
can a business below an income threshold?
It's not about the businesses. It's
Yes,
about
it
who
is.
those
It is a tax
I
credit.
understand that the tax credit
Sam.
goes to businesses,
Right.
but then only people who are below a certain income threshold can have access to the affordable housing units. That's
Right.
what the U.S. Treasury
I'm
tells
saying
us.
that there is not enough affordable housing. So while the policy for
So-
means-tested housing vouchers exists,
If
there
I
is not
tell
enough
you, if
housing
I
for
tell
those
you
people.
that by LIHTC units, there is a 4.2 percentage point vacancy rate across America, you're going to stand here and tell me there's not enough
I would
rents?
say that there's not enough spending on LAHTC, which is why there's
4.2% of units across America have no one living inside of them right now.
Right, and we're still saying that 75% of people can't find housing. So obviously there's like two
What
different
is the
arguments going on
reasoning
here.
for increasing spending when literally 4.2% of the units are not in use? There's no reason to build more of them.
Okay. Can I see the 4.2%?
I'm about to read it, so can I just give it to you after my rebuttal?
Sure.
Sweet.
Do you need time?
No. I do need some.
Alright, starting from now. That's 15 years.
Run some more.
He said that this one, it's not all LIHTC, states can do it, but the resolution has to.
There's no trade-off. I can bring it up.
Alright, another 10 years, so 25 in total.
Alright, is everybody ready? Cool. Start off with their first contention, which basically talks about economic revival. Like the thesis of this contention is that by creating economic growth, you're going to alleviate income inequality. But there's two main issues with this. The first is that even if you do have that, it only widens inequality. You can look to Stephen Chernofsky of the University of Georgia, who finds that when you have these types of infrastructure projects, because the rich are predisposed to being able to take advantage of those infrastructure projects in the first place, they therefore see a greater gain in their amount of capital when those infrastructure projects exist. It's not simply enough to create economic growth, because the rich are always going to be more predisposed to take advantage of that economic growth in the first place, thereby widening income inequality. Instead, we propose that you have to do the negative first. You have to give them education, to give them a stake in the labor market so that they're actually able to see the effects of this economic growth rather than simply being excluded. The second issue with this is that there's no actual net increase in economic growth. You can look to Marlon Bournet of the University of California, who says that even if there is an increase in certain areas, it only detracts from other areas which are adjacent. That reconcentrates poverty because you're detracting from areas with economic activity, and consequently you're only moving it to other parts of the country. He therefore finds that there's no statewide increase in economic activity. Now move on to the first warrant here, which talks about increasing the access to activity. The first issue with it is that you can't extrapolate it throughout the country. You can look to Joe Klotnick of Ford, finds that the public transportation infrastructure they're talking about only works in 6 cities that were designed and built before the automobile was even created, because the jobs aren't concentrated enough in those areas, and therefore people can't effectively use public transportation infrastructure even when it's made. That's important, because even if you develop it in like those 6 cities, you're not actually needed to prioritize on like a federal holistic level. You can still do welfare programs. But the second issue with this, they read this Chetty evidence saying that the most important predictor of upward mobility is commute times, but that comes from a study by Chetty of Harvard, and he specifically says in his own abstract that he doesn't control for causality. Therefore, there's no reason to believe this study because it's simply because those people are in like poor concentrated areas in the first place. It's not causal. Then move on to their second impact here, which talks about increasing jobs. The first issue with this is they disproportionately go to the upper class. You can look to the Department of the Treasury, finds that 90% of the jobs which are created by infrastructure go to the middle class because employers prefer to hire the middle class when they're creating construction jobs. Therefore, if you improve the skills of the lower class first, they're more likely to be able to access the jobs that are created by infrastructure. It's a prerequisite to see an actual alleviation in income inequality. But the second issue with this is that the jobs that aren't created aren't going to be substantial enough, because the IMF writes that for every one job created by public investment, you lose one job in private investment due to the crowd effect, because they're forced to like increase investment rates and increase the tax rate, which ultimately deters private companies from investing in the areas. Then move on to their second contention, which talks about homelessness, and they're basically saying we should build affordable housing. There's going to be two really big issues with the topicality of this argument. The first is that they're not advocating for public infrastructure. They're just saying we should build infrastructure in general, but they're saying we should only allow that infrastructure to be accessed by the poor. And essentially, they're means testing their infrastructure, right? So the definition of public infrastructure is that it's a public good, and therefore has to be non-rival risk and non-excludable, but they say that that's not the case because it only goes to poor people. There's zero risk of topicality. But the second issue with this is that even if there is some level of topicality, it doesn't matter because the impacts they derive come from price control of those houses by keeping the rents in those houses low, not from actual increase in spending, so it's not resolutional because the benefits don't come from increased spending. But the third overview on the impact level of this argument is you can look to Amnesty International, who finds that there's currently 18.5 million vacant homes in the country, despite there being only 3.5 million homeless people. The problem isn't a lack of housing, it's the fact that people can't afford the housing, which is why you need programs like the EITC and Pell Grants so that people have the income to afford housing in the first place. One of their first warrant here, which talks about how you put them at a competitive disadvantage, you can look to Chang Lee of the University of Chicago, finds that public housing projects such as that reconcentrate poverty because you just put a lot of poor people into concentrated areas, and politicians tend to put them in specific areas. Therefore, you're not increasing the competitive advantage because you're making poverty more deep. Their second warrant here talks about lead paint, how you're going to remove that, but first, they don't show you the need to prioritize. They don't say, like, why we can't solve lead paint while devoting the majority of our budget to welfare. And secondly, if you use programs like Medicaid, you can detect problems such as lead paint poisoning early on, allowing you to put them in remedial care, whereas otherwise they have no way of knowing whether they're exposed to lead paint or not. And then third, on homelessness, first you can look at Fisher in 2015, finds that housing vouchers decrease homelessness by 3/4, therefore we impact their only better than they do. And secondly, the program they're talking about, the LAHCC, according to Enterprise Community, finds that the average vacancy of the program is 4.2%, when the problem isn't that there isn't enough funding because there's a lot of vacant houses right now, it's the fact that people aren't moving in.
I want to see the jobs go to the upper class. This is all from the first contention, on the responses jobs. Jobs go to the upper class.
The 90% middle class?
Yep, and then the crowding out.
Yeah.
Those are the two responses you read, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you still want the 4.2% vacancy? No? Okay.
We can give you the,
Yeah, can I just get the study right now?
Yeah, sure.
Starting now.
Can you just look at that on my speech?
I need his favorite colors.
I've given up.
Yeah, that's fine. And then can I see the other one?
What was it?
The crowding out.
8 used for that.
You want the full study again?
Yep. And can I look at that during his speech or no?
I'd rather you not.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't hear the first time.
Okay, so it's going to be a lot easier for you to read the warrant if it's like this, and then the
This is
study,
what? Oh, if it's in the.
because I got the results in
that's
the
fine.
warrant, and then the study's right there for you to look at.
Okay, thank you.
Starting prep again.
Oh wait, how do I get back to the other thing? To the actual study?
It's just one tab.
I got 20 users.
Oh,
It's right there.
control. Okay, cool. Yeah.
Starting again.
Okay, thank you.
25 views.
Yeah.
You're gonna keep running, you're good.
All answers ready. Ready. All right. So as an off-time moment briefly, I'm going to sort of review just their first response to our first contention, and then I'm going to go down their case and then try to get that.
So the first response on your case, where you said overview and then?
Yeah, overview, then their
Where should
first.
the overview be?
Right at the top.
Which
whose case?
Your flow?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, our
So it goes overview on your flow, then responding to their responses, then like traditional law.
Overview on our flow, responding to only their first response on our first contention, and then down their case. So,
Starting off in today's debate, they talk about this idea of the Hill saying that 93% of economic growth is occurring at the top percentile. Why that's very important is my opponents are doing nothing in today's debate to confront that issue. We as the pro are the only ones who are trying to do something to actually stop the systematic oppression that is occurring between the rich and the poor by providing them with jobs. Then he talks about this thing how education and job-based growth are the two most important things in today's debate in terms of income inequality. Ozan and I would venture to argue that job-based growth is the more important of those two words because simply put, that is the growth that causes a sustainable way to fight against income inequality, and that's why you should prefer it. With that being said, look to his first response at our contention where he talked about how infrastructure is predisposed to going to the rich. Recognize that doesn't really respond to anything we're saying in our advocacy, when specifically we show you percentage gains of wages by the bottom quintile of people and the middle class as well. Why you look to the middle class is because actually CNN tells you the biggest income inequality occurs between the middle class and the rich, and insofar as we're impacting to those two, you should be weighing those equally as important. Don't just look to the idea that infrastructure inherently just helps the rich. Now on to their case. Starting off with their first contention, they talk about housing vouchers. I'm going to have a couple of responses. So first, what the Maynard Center explains to you is housing vouchers don't solve for the problems that people face in these communities for a couple of reasons. One, people actually lack the information of where there is affordable housing places to move in the community, so they're stuck. Secondly, people prefer to go to places that they're already comfortable with, and they know. Why that's very important is because it ends up concentrating poverty. When you have all these poor people all living in the same area, poverty becomes concentrated. That is extremely important because according to the New York University, concentrations of poverty are one of the biggest drivers of income inequality because it affects generations after generations after generations. But secondly, this can empirically be seen by The Atlantic, which explains to you in the Chicago program where 4,600 families enrolled with housing vouchers because it really did nothing. It just located them to another poor area. They had all the same problems they did before in terms of education, in terms of wages, and saw no benefit. But thirdly, you can turn the argument against my opponent because what we do with the situation is we move them from where they're comfortable to an area they're not according to City Journal, and now voucher holders have trouble paying for the higher rent and have less disposable income, so at the end of the day, it's harming them because they lose access to what they had before. Then on the second condition, they talk about Medicaid. I'm going to have a couple of responses. So first off, recognize the response Ozan makes in Crossfire that's really important, that Obamacare has already solved for this in expanding broadband access. We don't need to increase spending on Medicaid. But secondly, what the Wall Street Journal explains to you is that Medicaid actually leads to worse care given to people. The reason being for this is because states are forced to offer everything at every time, and the actual payment rates are driven so low that the service of quality is cut. That's why empirically, patients on Medicaid end up having higher fatality rates and worse care than those who don't even have insurance at all. So at the end of the day, we shouldn't be funding a system that is inherently broken. Let's fix the system, not just fund something that's not working. Thirdly, he talks about the EITC, a couple of responses. The first of which is the EITC doesn't solve income inequality. What the New York Times explains to you is all the EITC does and what they impact you is try to help alleviate people out of poverty. The problem with it is people just waver around the poverty line for several years. They don't actually see any broad-based wage growth. They don't actually ascend to places where they can fight against income inequality. But secondly, what Lehigh University explains to you is because the EITC leads to people wanting to keep their benefits, they're disincentivized from going out and getting higher paid jobs, and there's a 5% decrease in wages for people on the EITC because they want to keep their EITC benefit. Then he talks about how single mothers, and that's really important to recognize that's really bad actually, because what the economy explains to you is it incentivizes single parent households, which ends up having harmful effects on the children. Then on the impact level, he talks about the idea of the EITC helping the educational outcomes of children, but that isn't actually true because the Center of Budget Policy Priority finds that the EITC, this encourages long-term planning and long-term saving because there's a lump sum given to you on tax day. Finally, on Pell Grants, a couple of responses. James Hawken from the University of Chicago is saying 50% of educational disparities occur before you're even 18. We solve for that better because our current infrastructure in school has a D rating. By increasing our infrastructure in schools, we increase learning by 25% and decrease absenteeism. That's why empirically Pell Grant users graduate at a 15% lower rate. By solving for the problem at the earlier stage, we should prioritize us because that's obviously a better solution to the problem because then they can graduate more, accessing their benefits better.
Can I see the 15% lower graduation rates?
Of Pell Grant?
Yeah.
Do you want card or
Card's fine, I just want to confirm. Where? Yeah.
Can we use your timer?
Yeah.
Alright, everybody ready? So you say 53% of disparities occur before you're 18.
That's what James Hawken finds.
Sure. What do you do to stop that?
what we do to stop that is build schools that serve kids that.
Whoa, okay, so is that like a new advocacy introduced in Second Crossfire?
It's
Because
like a- it's like
your
a
argument
term-
of like school infrastructure has literally never come up in the round.
It's like a turn on your case, right? Like you're telling me we should prioritize education, like helping people with
Okay,
education.
so here's
I
what's
say
important.
infrastructure is a better way to do that.
So this
because
is
we should invest
super
in it.
unfair, because if your advocacy this whole time was school infrastructure, I should have been able to respond to that in my rebuttal.
Wait, am I
But
not allowed
moreover,
to talk about infrastructure as a whole? Like, am I only
Well,
restricted to
Sam
talking about
talked to
stuff
O-
in case? Like, that's like, how is that fair to me?
Well,
When you can expand
here's
on
the
stuff
thing.
in rebuttal,
If
and
Sam
I can't.
asked Ozon in First Crossfire, like, what type of infrastructure are you advocating for? He said things like public transit, highways. It's unfair
No,
to
no, no.
use-
He specifically said, "What are you advocating for in your first contention?" He never asked what you're advocating
Okay,
for.
so
on the whole.
affordable housing, that's advocating for education. That's schools.
Wait, affordable housing is like advocating.
Like,
for
I'm just
affordable
I'm not
housing.
clear on how it's fair of you to introduce new advocacies in Second Crossfire. How is
I
that, like,
didn't
how
do
does
the
that make
second
this debate
speech, not
okay?
the Crossfire. And also, like, I don't fundamentally understand your argument, right? Like, I read a response to your case proving that infrastructure turns it. It's not like a new advocacy. It's me literally interpreting the resolution and saying, this is under my I can say this under my purview, and I'm saying it to prove you wrong. Can I
Okay,
ask you a
so
question
what
now?
is education?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You have the whole thing. Okay, so when you talk about the city of Medicaid, right, and you still haven't answered this, how does Obamacare not solve for that by increasing access to
So
everyone?
here's what Obamacare does. It expands the breadth of people who are enrolled in Medicaid. What it doesn't do is expand the depth of payment that we're giving to doctors. So when you talk about how doctors are giving worse care to Medicaid patients, it's because they know they're not going to be reimbursed enough. If you make it so that Medicaid reimburses them sufficiently, they'll equalize the level of care given.
Wait, that is like just factually untrue. Like Obamacare increases funding into Medicaid when it was implemented that solved back for this problem already to occur.
I don't agree with that. What Obamacare has done, well, first of all, Obamacare 26 states said they wouldn't expand Medicaid, right? But
No, that's not true.
okay.
Obamacare included expansion of Medicaid.
But what it did is it put
Like
more
I-
people onto Medicaid without increasing the level of reimbursement that comes alongside Medicaid.
But
That's-
fundamentally, the problem with Medicaid is that the system provides like just provides care over quality. We need to reform the system as a whole, not
So
just pour money
the
into it.
implication of care over quality is that because they're trying to give care to more people, is that they pay less to doctors. The solution to that, I would say, is to pay more to doctors.
So
Do you have
what
a
effect
question?
does that have on the economy then?
What effect does that have on the
Huge
economy?
increases, like,
Well,
if
when
doctors
people are
were-
less likely to die because doctors are treating them like they're human beings instead of people who are poor, that actually means that they're more able to work because they're no longer
How much?
systematically crippled
Like, don't
by
give me these
illness.
like rhetoric responses. I want some like concrete facts here. Like, what does this have to do with income inequality? How many
What
more
the
people
LIM
are
evidence
working?
tells you is that health and poor health creates a self-perpetuating cycle of poverty because people aren't able to work enough to advance their social position, which ultimately causes them to be more likely to fall into poverty again later.
Alright, sounds good.
Do you have a quick question, or should we sit down?
I'm probably sit. Do you want to sit down?
I'm tired, yeah. Yeah.
Can we see that LIM evidence, by the way?
Sure.
Are you taking prep, by the way?
You just called for evidence, so
Yeah, it's
you're
kind of your problem.
Wait, no, you're first.
Well, you just called for
during
the
the
prep.
speech?
No.
No, he needs a prep. Wait, do you not need prep then? It's fine.
Are you
we'll
gonna-
prep. We'll-
Yeah, you guys can.
Okay, yeah, as soon as you're done, we'll start working our prep.
Okay, yeah.
That's 15 U's plus the 25 before. And we'll start running our prep now. Minute 15 used, so 45 left. Because you used 15 and minute 30.
What?
Wait,
Matt.
I just used a minute 15.
Alright, that's all good.
Alright, cool.
So it's gonna start on their case and then go to ours. I'll sign those. Judge ready? Goes on. Chase.
On my opponent's first contention, extended a couple key responses from Chase's rebuttal. The first from Cotnick that says in his analysis of 29 cities, only in 6 cities did expanding transit systems actually provide any benefits. You're seeing that on net, on the whole of America, there will be no net benefits to increasing transit infrastructure in America. There's no reason to prioritize. Then on jobs, Chase reads 2 responses. First from the Treasury that 90% of the jobs go to the middle class. They tell you the wages still rise and the middle and the rich is the biggest gap. But we would contend that you need to prefer the lower of the low because they are most held down by the oppressive structures of income inequality in America. Insofar as 90% of the jobs are going to the middle class, we see no benefits to those who actually need it most and no reason to affirm in today's round. Second, remember the IMF that for every public job created, another private job is being crowded out. There's no net benefit to employment. Now on contention 2, Chase reads 3 things about topicality. The first, that their advocacy is not public infrastructure. You have to have a means-tested infrastructure, which is what they advocate for. Second, this is all about price controls. There's no need for increased spending. Third, from Amnesty, that there are currently 18.5 million vacant households, yet only 3.8 million homeless people. There's no reason to actually expand the infrastructure that we have when there is certainly enough to solve the problem. Then remember that as in their own advocacy, there is a 4.2 percentage point vacancy rate across what they're advocating for. There's no need for increased spending insofar as we currently have leftover units. But now down our case. He tells you that there are no benefits from housing vouchers. You don't need to move. The money saved is still enough, which is why the CBPP finds that there are 1 million people pulled out of poverty every year by housing vouchers. He tells you that Obamacare solves in response to our subpoint B. We agree, we don't get any benefits, but don't let them extend their terms. Then on EITC, he says you see a 5% decrease in wages. This is only for high school dropouts. EITC increases educational attainment. But now let's talk about Pell Grants. He makes a couple misconceptions. The first is that 50% of the disparities happen before college. They literally do nothing to solve for this. Don't let them advocate for building schools in second summary. Then he says there's a 15% lower graduation rate. This compares low-income Pell students to high-income students. It's not comparative. Prefer Bettinger, who tells you that when you have Pell Grants, you decrease dropout rates among low-income students by 9.2 percentage points. Extend IMF that says that educational attainment is the largest driver of income inequality. And Wright that says if we do nothing, the Pell Grant system will fail. Thus, you need to negate to keep it alive.
I wasn't counting. I was started late and I was just like, okay. I was hoping you were counting.
No, because y'all took the 15 seconds to read the cards at the beginning, so it'd be 15.
Or 15. It's all good. Alright. I'm just gonna start on their case and go back to ours.
Sorry, what was it? Our case? Your case?
Yeah. Ready? Starting on their housing contention, he does not do enough in his summary to respond to our terms. Remember, we tell you that if they're not moving, they're only concentrating poverty further within their neighborhoods. Amar tells you in Chicago specifically, that's what made the housing program fail. They tell you that we need to concentrate on the lowest of the low. We're only concentrating poverty and making it even worse, concentrating the structural oppression that they tell you is so important. They're only making worse with housing measures. Then second, go to EITC. Remember, he responds to this wages thing, but Amar tells you specifically, and they don't respond to this, that they just fluctuate over and under the poverty line. There's no actual impact back to income inequality from this contention. Don't give give them options there. But then third on Pell Grants. This is a very clear place where you can vote for us. Because Amar at the bottom of his rebuttal does say that we can build school infrastructure, but that is not like it's some like brand new advocacy that's like a reason to drop us. Don't give them necessarily any sort of like theory impacts. We're telling you that you need to invest in the school infrastructure in things like public schools, because that's where the educational attainment matters. Because that's where it matters. Before I go to college, that's where the majority of my learning occurs. If there are more rats in the schools than there are kids, you're not going to be able to learn. We solve for that in the affirmative world. That's the only world we can make sure that the Pell Grant programs are even more successful. We do their educational attainment better. The easiest place you can vote for us, though, is off our first contention. They say two things. One, they say econ growth predisproportionately goes to the rich. Remember, Amar tells you that we have no link to econ growth, but two, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and the Secretary of Transportation are both redesigning the projects in the status quo to prevent it from going to the rich. But then two responses to jobs. First, he says the jobs go to the upper class. The problem is, I call for the card. It says that 90% of the jobs are medium to high class paying, so that if poor people get the jobs, they will now be medium to high class earners. Their evidence is crap on this. But then second, the other thing they tell you is that it crowds out investing. Their crowd from here is from Asia and from Africa and from the Middle East. There's no actual topicality to America here. That's why you can extend the 5.5 million jobs annually, clean a claustrophobe. That's the biggest impact to income inequality, because we say a 1% increase in employment increases wages by 1% for every single person. That means that we are raising wages and decreasing income inequality the greatest on scope, because we are affecting every single person who has a job, not just the poor. Every single person who has a job has an increase in wages, and we tell you the biggest divergence is between the middle and the high, so we're the only ones who are addressing that the most. You vote for us, that is your ballot.
Alright. Are you guys ready for questions? Alright. So what were your responses to food stamps?
What food stamps?
Oh, we're advocating for that now. Like that's just like that's our that's it.
Like we're just advocating for welfare
Yeah,
generally, so that's like our
yeah.
new argument.
Like food stamps and TANF. Anything else that you want to run?
Yeah, like you see how that might create an unfair debate if we did that?
I mean,
So if we just randomly introduce advocacy throughout the round.
right now if you want me to.
I'd rather you not. That's not the point I'm trying to make.
Like
I really
you
don't want to
you
have
did
this
not
right
bring
now.
this up in your rebuttal at all. Like I know
Wait, I brought up building.
What you said in rebuttal is like, it starts before age 18. You don't say build new schools in rebuttal.
I'm
Wait,
sorry,
I said in the bottom of my rebuttal, you build new schools that increases educational attainment by 25%.
I'm sorry if you guys
So,
are listening at the last 20 seconds of his rebuttal, but we
the
said
last thing you said was a falsified graduation stat on Pell Grants and then time cut you off. At no point during your actual constructive did you advocate for the building of schools. Even more so, at no point have you provided us with any reason to prefer that or prioritize
I
it.
tell you prefer that because the majority of educational attainment occurs before you're 18, before you even get that.
Okay, that's why we have programs like the EITC, which improves income for households, so they're actually able to pay for like food on their table. So that's
it doesn't actually alleviate income
well,
inequality.
all right. That's not our impact under EITC. The impact where it's coming under EITC, they're more likely to go to college, not that their wages go up, right? So that's why your impact defense isn't relevant or responsive to our impact.
First off, the one thing you extended in summary was the idea of poverty.
No, I
No.
said that your
You
decreased
say that we
wages
don't-
was a lie and that EITC increases educational attainment rates.
I mean,
That
way,
was
you don't
the
respond to the ink that Omar still has on there that says that it
about single parent
long-term.
households. I'm not
It
even gonna waste
disincentivizes
my
No, it
time.
disincentivizes
long-term
long-term savings and
and
long-term
long-term
planning
planning,
because it's a
which is
single lump
huge.
sum in the short term.
Exactly. Can we ask you a question now?
Sure.
Okay. So
What
when
do you know? How many people do your welfare programs affect?
Poor people, a lot of them.
How many? I want a number.
120
I said
million. Like
65 million people are in Medicaid.
How many are in EITC?
I don't know. Do you know?
I don't know. I'm asking you. Because
You're
I'm telling you
So
right
like,
now
it's our
that
argument is that
every
we should
single person
expand
who's
it,
low
right?
income and every single person who's middle income, if they have
This
a
is like-
job, they see a wage boost in the affirmative world. They see the biggest they see a big
whoa,
increase in their
that is a
wages.
really big
Because
because
you do
you
not
just said you're
respond
going
to
to employ every single low
No,
and
no, no.
middle income person in
You're
America.
misinterpreting. No, you're misinterpreting the argument. What me and Ozan are talking about are creating a tighter economy. Simply put, when more people are employed, people have to compete for employment, which drives up wages for everyone.
Okay,
That is
so like-
one. That is
no, no,
evidence that
so
you
like-
straight drop in rebuttal and in summary.
No, so let's talk about employment. We read you from the IMF that for every one public job, there's one private job.
and
Where is
Ozan
that
is-
evidence from? What is that analyzing? It's analyzing Asia, the
It's
Middle
not
East,
the
Africa,
international.
and
No,
the
we
Caucasus.
said it says Asia,
Like read
Africa,
the abstract
and the
of your own
Caucasus.
study, guys.
Like, and that's why it's from the International Monetary Fund.
I didn't know International Monetary Fund
I
literally
didn't
just
know
meant
that
Asia.
like,
I imagine it being
Africa
Asian
and the Middle
Monetary
East
Fund
and
if it
Asia
only studied
applied
Asia.
to what happens in the United States, guys. Like
It literally
just read
says
some, like,
that it has the
legitimate
same
evidence
effects
here.
on advanced economies. Stop misconstruing our evidence.
I mean, like you have to provide a legitimate warrant as to why that's the case.
Well, I'd say the reason for that. Oh, okay.
So we're on 30, 45.
Alright, everybody ready? It's going to be the same structure as Sam's summary, so their case and then our case. Start off on their argument about economic activity. The biggest issue with this that goes drop throughout the round is the Cotnick evidence you read you, which shows that the transportation infrastructure programs are talking about only work in the 6 cities that were built and designed before the automobile. Therefore, you can't extrapolate that to the rest of the country and expect it to have the same impacts. Moreover, they give you no reason why that needs to be prioritized. Then on jobs, what we tell you is that most of those jobs aren't actually going to help the lower class. That's corroborated by the Hill evidence you read you at the top of our case in the framework, which shows that 93% of wage gains have gone to the top 1%. The bigger picture analysis here, though, is that if you improve education levels first and then create these jobs, they have a better chance of actually being able to access those jobs because they have a higher stake in the labor market. Therefore, we access their impact better than they do. Now go on to the vouchers argument. What we tell you is that even if they don't move, which they say they won't move, they're still going to be able to save money through the vouchers. That's how they're still being benefited. Then on the second contention about EITC, he tells you that wages are only going to fluctuate, they're not actually going to go. But that impact defense is really bad because our impact we extend throughout the round isn't about wages, it's about increased chance of college enrollment. That's why the terminator evidence tells you that a $1,000 increase in the EITC leads to a 10% increase in likelihood that a child enrolls in colleges. So even if their income isn't going up, in the long term, intergenerational poverty is going down because they're more likely to enroll in college. But once they get into college, we solve that problem even better through Pell Grants. But they try to tell you that we should build more schools. They literally don't make that argument, but in any point in the round, moreover, it's not fair of them to do that. But they don't tell you how they solve it either. And we tell you that you do solve it because because by increasing income and things like that, you're able to make sure that they have a better home environment growing up. So you're able to make a huge impact on their lives before they are 18. Then he tells you that there's going to be a decrease in graduation rates, but that study compares low-income people to high-income people. Whereas we tell you with the Davidson study that they're 41% more likely to drop out than high-income students without a Pell Grant, whereas they're 5% less likely to drop out if they have a Pell Grant. This is important for 3 reasons. The first is the IMF study we read you in our framework, which tells you that the biggest driver of inequality is educational disparities. We're the only team linking into that. But secondly, if you don't prioritize it, it's going to start to fail. The right evidence tells you that unless you prioritize the program, they're going to freeze it, meaning that it won't keep up with inflation. But the third and the biggest reason is that it's a prerequisite to the poor being able to access all of the benefits they talk about in their case, because if you give people education first, they're actually able to see the benefits of the jobs that are created, whereas otherwise they're just excluded and they see no decrease in inequality. Feel comfortable negating.
Okay, we have like 30 seconds left?
15. Okay, the last 15 seconds. Judges, opponents ready? The first place you vote for us is on the concentration of poverty, and he really mishandles this argument. I agree with him, maybe people are saving more money, but at the fundamental end of the day, they're still living in an impoverished life area. Why that is very important, because the New York University explains to you, the concentration of poverty is the fundamental driver of income inequality because it stops intergenerational earning, intergenerational mobility. Insofar as they do nothing to solve for that, in fact, they just entrench that problem, you should be voting for us on that issue because it actually impacts the income inequality, not just them saving a little more money. The second place you should be voting for us is on education. Maybe I remember my rebuttal wrong, but it's written down and I'm pretty sure I said it. I talked about building schools. I talked about how our education infrastructure had a D rating and we needed to innovate it, which leads to 25% increases in learning and decreases in absenteeism. Why that's very important is the Heckman card. I tell you that 50% of the educational gap occurs before you're 18. So even if you buy my Pell Grant argument, we're still solving for it better because we address it at an earlier stage of life and we address more of the problem. We make the Pell Grant more effective. That's why you prioritize it. But even on that whole educational issue, they give you no justifiable warrant for why you prefer education. They say you prefer education because it leads to jobs. If me and Ozan can provide jobs more directly, you vote for us, and that's exactly what we do in our first contention. So he tries to tell you this argument about how, in 6 cities it does not going to work. But that's not what we talk about in our third warrant. What we talk about in our third warrant is we give them infrastructure jobs. What those infrastructure jobs do is they start the ball rolling of creating a tighter economy where more people are employed and more people are competing for employment. That happens in every city across the United States. Why that is crucially important, because first their IMF thing is talking about Asia and the Caucasus, it's not talking about the US. When you look to the United States, what we tell you is 5.5 million jobs are being created because of the induced spending, because of the induced labor market. This is the biggest impact in today's round because it doesn't just affect the lower class, it affects the middle class. Remember, these jobs are classified as middle class jobs, they're not actually going to the middle class. Because we are affecting more people on scope, because we're addressing the biggest gap in income inequality because between the rich and the middle class is the reason you vote for us in today's debate, because we provide the most sustainable solution.